Welcome back, friends. I am talking to you about a subject that I really haven't covered, and it's not the typical topic on my channel. But today I'm going to talk to you about Sean Combs. Several of you have asked me about my opinions, my thoughts about the Sean Combs trial. If you are new to my channel, welcome. I am an attorney. I have practiced in 3 states. I'm currently in Florida. I have a background as a prosecutor in Detroit when I specialized in child sex crimes. So if you are new, the focus of my channel has been on cases involving abuse in the church. There is a lot of abuse that is being exposed right now. It has been, you might have heard about the priests. There's all kinds of things going on, and a lot is in the news media. But myself and other podcaster friends, we are talking about abuse, particularly in the church, which involves spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, SA, and I have to abbreviate it in that manner because YouTube. So let's get into the topic of today, and it's all about Sean Combs. And I will here and there interject about stuff that I've been covering, especially with Tom Cassie. As you all know, I am covering that. So the people that have been following me, I am providing updates in regard to Tom Cassie. That's Ohio, the state of Ohio versus Tom Cassie. As y'all know, recently the jury trial that was scheduled for July 1st has now been moved. We don't yet have a date. I just checked today. A date has not been scheduled, but I anticipate that the continuance will be a couple months. We'll probably go into the fall. So if you have paid attention at all to the Sean Combs trial, you know that it is in federal court. It's in New York, and no cameras, no video. It's not televised. So we are all in the same boat. None of us, unless you go there live and you're in an overflow room, which is what the reporters are doing, we are dependent upon the reporters who are reporting on the case. And from my point of view, that's not ideal. I can't go to every case, but if I'm going to really delve in and talk about a case, I would like to go to the case so that I can evaluate the jury. Now, that's what I plan on doing when the Tom Cassie trial comes up in Ohio. I plan on going, I plan on watching, and I will be reporting on that. But here, not only do we not see the jury, we don't get to see the witnesses at all. So we are entirely in the dark. We are entirely dependent upon the reporters and what they have to share. And if you've been watching it at all, you're probably hearing so many different things, because once the reporters tell you what's going on, then you hear and you read comments, and it really goes either way. So I'm trying to give some clarity to some of the things that we've been seeing that's been happening over the past few weeks. Well, most recently, because I wanted to wait until after the closing arguments to do this video. And the timing was perfect because the closing arguments ended on a Friday, so now it's a Saturday. And the jury, I believe, I don't know if they're deliberating over the weekend. I really don't know. My understanding is that the judge gave them the option of how to deliberate, meaning the manner in which to do it, if they were going to start right away. I haven't heard anything about it. So if they took the weekend for themselves, then they would come back on Monday and start deliberating. So if you've watched my channel before, I talk about in jury trials evidence, witness testimony, how that evidence goes in. So we don't particularly know how it goes in. If it's clunky, a witness can be very, very credible. And by the way, the testimony that comes out of a witness, that's evidence. You've heard me say that before. But there's so many things, there's so many moving parts, there's factors when when you're doing a jury trial. You have to be really cognizant of that. As a prosecutor, we were always told, don't wear like excessive jewelry, don't wear things that could be distracting, so that the jury is just focusing on what you're saying. You want them to focus on the witness. When it's the prosecution's witness, the focus should be on them. When you're in cross-examination, the focus is typically going to be, at least the attorney who's doing the cross, they want it to be on them, but then obviously showing the holes or the attacks that they're doing on the witness that they're cross-examining. But so we don't really know how things went in, but we do know that the video of Cassie getting beat down by Sean Combs in a hotel, that was in evidence. And we know that there were photos in evidence, but a lot of it was the witness testimony. So let's just start with two things that have been buzzing around, and which really caused me to want to do this video for my audience, at least. The first thing is that after the prosecution rested, people were saying that, oh, Sean Combs' defense attorneys, they only took like 20 or 30 minutes to prove their case. Well, that's not quite accurate. They did not put on a case in chief, meaning they did not put on any evidence. And Sean decided not to testify, and that is his right. So, what is this 20 or 30 minutes of argument? Well, that's in reference to what typically happens, and this is in a state case or a federal case. What happens after the prosecution rests is there is, in the state cases, it's called a directed verdict. In federal, it's called a Rule 29 motion. So before the case would go to the jury, what the defense would argue is that, and that's what they did here, is that the evidence was not sufficient to go to the jury. So they're challenging the evidence and saying that it's not adequate for the jury to even convict on any of the crimes that were charged, and that it should stop right here, that there should be an acquittal entered by the judge. Well, the standard is that the judge has to hear the argument, because a record has to be made, because in the event Sean Combs is found guilty and then he's sentenced, there's an appeal. That's all of this is on the record. There's a court reporter taking everything down, and if there is a conviction, then he's likely going to appeal. So the judge has to ask, could a rational jury find the defendant guilty based upon the evidence that was submitted by the prosecution? That's the standard typically. That is essentially the standard. And these motions are rarely granted, meaning the judge will say, no, there's sufficient evidence that a reasonable jury can find the defendant guilty of at least some of these crimes. Well, it has to be at least all of them. It's usually the wording is scintilla of evidence. So just a small, minute portion or minute evidence. The argument is that at least there's this minimal threshold and that the jury could, in fact, find the defendant guilty. So again, it's rarely ever granted, and in this case, it was not granted. So then they move on to the closing arguments, and it's also called summation. So when you hear summation, it's the same thing, closing arguments. The next thing that I've heard that I wanted to address, because it's kind of jacking up the internet, people were saying that the prosecution dismissed some charges. No, they did not dismiss any charges. There's 5 charges. There's the RICO conspiracy, that's the racketeering, and then there's 2 charges of sex trafficking, and then there's 2 charges of the transportation. So there's 5 charges that they started out actually with 3, and then there was a superseding indictment. You've heard this from me before on the Tom Cassie case. That means that there's a subsequent indictment, so then other charges were added, and here just another addition of sex trafficking and an addition of the transportation. So 5 in total, which is the number of charges that they started with at the time of the trial, and they're still ending with 5. Nothing's changed. There's only, what happened was the prosecutors, they sent in a letter to the judge on June 24th saying that they were, I don't want to use dismiss, they were not going to utilize as predicate acts attempt kidnapping, attempt arson, and there was one other. I know there was one other, and I can't remember what that was, and I thought that I had it down here. All right, I'm going to move on because I thought I put it down here, but that's what it was. Even though my understanding is that the prosecution still argued those things as predicate acts for the RICO, they were trying to simplify it for the jury, because what happens is the jury will get instructions, okay? They are to utilize these instructions when they're deliberating. Now, as a prosecutor, I'm speaking about my own experience and just in general because I've seen it thousands of times over. You try to weave the wording of the instructions in through your case. So I would start with my opening statement. I'm going to have some of those elements weaved throughout my opening statement. I might also use some of the wording of the elements in some of the testimony that I elicit from the witnesses. And I'm surely going to hammer that in my closing argument. In fact, when I would do my closing argument, when I was preparing for a jury trial, I would outline my closing argument first, because that is going to give you that roadmap of the evidence that you need in your case in chief. I don't know if everybody does it that way. That's how I would do it. So, I got it. So the ones that they dropped, so to speak, of the predicate acts under the RICO charge is the attempt kidnapping, the attempt arson, and aiding and abetting in sex trafficking. But there's plenty of other underlying crimes which are considered the overacts. These are terms that we use, overacts or predicate acts, that can be utilized for to serve as the basis for the RICO charge. Even the sex trafficking, that's a basis for the RICO. So no charges were dropped, just so you guys understand that. The prosecutor's theory is that Sean Combs, when they were arguing, and I'm taking this on, I heard a couple of videos, people that were taking the actual transcripts. It's very hard to get the transcripts when you're in the middle of trial, but apparently they were doing that here. But essentially what they argued, the government, their theory is that Sean Combs does not take no for an answer. And they argued that the sex trafficking was fueled by his power, wealth, and intimidation tactics. So the argument is that Sean Combs took his multifaceted companies, his businesses, these are enterprises, and turned it into a criminal enterprise that he used employees to engage in kidnapping, arson, physical violence, sex trafficking, and forced labor. That's the essence of the argument. And so, it's interesting that, and I don't know if any of you can comment here too, if you've been watching it as well. So there's 2 sex trafficking, 2 transportation. And interestingly, from what I understood is that there was initially 3 victims. So, but only 2 of those charges. And if you heard early on, one of those victims disappeared. Actually, she and her attorney, I haven't heard anything else about it. I don't know if there's been anything else to report on it. So I was surprised that there were not more victims that were utilized in this criminal prosecution. If any of you have been following this, you probably know that there are civil cases right now pending. There are multiple victims that are filing civil lawsuits against Sean Combs. And some of them are adults that have alleged that they were children at the time of the SA. So I really anticipated that at least some of these adults that are looking back and they were children at the time would have been included in this federal criminal charge, but they weren't. And I don't know why. So I thought it was strange. So the prosecutor, from my understanding, the judge said each side had 4 hours, but it is my understanding that the prosecutor went about 5 hours. And so they laid out the RICO charges and discussed the acts that comprise the RICO, and they tied it to the sex trafficking, sorry, I'm itchy, and transportation to engage in prostitution counts. So what is RICO? Let's just, in case you just don't have a clear idea of what it is. It is the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. This was enacted in 1970, which was part of the Organized Crime Control Act, which was from that year as well. And it was enacted to combat crimes that were being committed by the mafia. So I want to do a little sidebar here for those that, because I have a feeling that, you know, if you're interested in Sean Combs, maybe you have not watched my channel, but for those that have, you know what I've been reporting on. And I believe that churches are acting like the mafia. And I believe that we might potentially see federal investigation and ultimately federal crimes against some of these mega ministries that we have all been reporting on and following. So that's just my little sidebar right there. So the government, back to Sean Combs, the government has to show that Sean Combs used his business enterprises to facilitate abuse and exploitation of victims, to protect his reputation, and to conceal his conduct. So they alleged that Combs, now remember, Combs was charged, it's the U.S. versus Sean Combs. There were no other defendants charged in this criminal complaint, this indictment. And it can be done that way. A lot of times there are co-conspirators because you've got RICO conspiracy. So in this case, the government is saying that, well, these other people that were being used to do these things, they didn't have the intent to do the criminal enterprise, but Sean Combs did. That's what they're arguing. And that's a sufficient basis in which to utilize that statute. So the argument is that Combs, along with others that he used in his businesses, they committed crimes that included the sex trafficking, the arson, the kidnapping, the forced labor, the bribery, obstruction of justice, all these things. The two victims, one used her real name, one did not, Cassie Ventura, and they're both adults. And I've said this before on my channel. When it comes to SA, you can go under a pseudonym. You don't have to use your real name if you don't want to. Now here, Cassie Ventura did. If you follow my channel, Robert Morris is a great example. Robert Morris was the spiritual advisor to President Trump in his first administration. He is a disgrace. Robert Morris has been charged with 5 counts of SA against a child, and that's Cindy Clemishar. She is using her real name. We all know this. So Cassie Ventura and Jane Doe, and they were both girlfriends of Sean Combs. So, and they were both adults at the time. So, you know, the argument by the defense is that they're willing participants. So when you're dealing with the case, whether the prosecution or the defense, the parties, the attorneys, you're weaving your theory in and out of everything you do throughout the case. And the defense's job is to poke holes in the evidence, discredit the witnesses, and to turn the victims into the villains. and to try to persuade the jury that their client is actually the victim. And that's essentially what's done in all of these criminal trials. So we've all seen the video of Sean Combs beating Cassie Ventura. It's at a hotel in California. And the defense argues, and they concede, they say, yes, that is sufficient to establish domestic violence, but he was not charged with domestic violence, and that is true. So interestingly, even though that there's evidence of all of these acts that are happening not just in New York, the prosecution did say in their closing argument that you have to find at least one of these acts to have been committed in the Southern District of New York. From my understanding, when the prosecution was giving their summation that Sean Combs was getting nervous or squirming and didn't look very comfortable when they got to the sex trafficking arguments, his whole family was in the courtroom behind him for the summation. And I can imagine that would be unsettling to have your family members hear the things that you've done. But there they were. And that's done because obviously the defense wants to show that he has the support of his family and that he must be a good family guy. There's a lot of optics that go on with jury trials, you guys. So, all right, so the prosecution does this 5-hour summation, and then that's on Thursday of this week, and then the defense, they do it in about 4. Now, I want to focus really on the defense because we've heard the reports from the prosecution. You guys have heard it, but I really wanted to focus on the defense. So that's what really I'm going to do. And the things that they argued, because they didn't put in on a case in chief. They didn't put anything into evidence. And Sean Combs decided not to testify, which is interesting because when you've got a situation where it's he said, she said, you really need the other side of it, right? You've got Cassie and Jane Doe saying, he made me do this. This is how he did it. And their opinions and their view of it. You don't have the other view. Sometimes it's not important for the defendant to take the stand, but when you have a situation like this, I think that it is. Now, the jury is charged with the instruction that you can't use the fact that he didn't testify against him. But you know what? When you talk to juries afterwards, or they come on and they write a book, or they're on a documentary, they say that affected them, even though they're told that they cannot consider that in their deliberations. It's just a reality. So the defense argued that all of this, the freak offs, all of this stuff, that this is just their lifestyle. And this is how they showed love to each other and belonging, whatever. It's disturbing to me because I just don't see, even if you are into, weird stuff, I just don't see how that argument is going to fly with the jury. I just personally, maybe you do, and I'd love to hear what you have to say, but they argued that the RICO charge was misused by the government and that it's a complicated statute, which it is. It's a very broad and encompassing statute. But if you have a handle on that, which the government should, because they're federal prosecutors, they should know this inside and out. Hopefully they were able to do a good job in outlining everything and what the jury needed to do to find every element of the crime was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That was their burden to do. So the defense attorney, Mark Agnifilo, if I'm saying it correctly, he did the closing argument. He argued that Sean Combs became a very successful black male entrepreneur. entrepreneur. I can never say that. Entrepreneur? You know what I'm talking about. So he essentially made fun of the raids of Sean Diddy Combs' homes. Remember, those raids were conducted earlier this year. They were in Miami and in California. And this is what he said in his closing. He said, "Way to go, fellas. You guys just do you." Talking about the recovery into evidence of the Astroglide and all of those bottles of baby oil. I mean, that is what the defense does. They will mock, they will undermine, they will focus on things that seem inconsequential, which is what they did here. That's not just the evidence. That's part of the evidence. That's part of the picture. But that just goes along and corroborates what the witnesses testified to about all of the, the escorts coming in and all the things that they did and what they used. It's not about those products, but, that's what they do. They try to make it very murky and poke not only holes in the evidence that was presented by the prosecution, but they also want to poke fun at it. And that's the sense that I got from hearing the kinds of things that he said. And, just arguing that none of these things amounted to a criminal case. That none of these things, whether it was the freak offs, whether it was hiring these workers, that it was just hiring for their time, not necessarily that it was hiring them for the actual sex acts. At the end of the day, it's up to the jury to decide. So at least he admitted that they own the domestic violence that was seen on the video. But then later, I think it was in poor taste. He also argued that what they saw in that video was that Cassie took Sean Combs' phone and that Sean was trying to retrieve it. So he's trying to retrieve it by beating her down. I just think that was very poor taste. Now, again, I didn't see how this was delivered because this is on a transcript. So we're very limited in speaking about this case. We really are. But if that was the argument, and I understand it to be, I would have thought twice about bringing that argument. I think that was very, that was in bad taste. And I just don't think that argument would do well with the jury. So the defense argued that he being Sean Combs, did not do the things that he's been charged with, the racketeering, the sex trafficking, kidnapping, and all those things. And he describes it as a modern love story between Sean Combs and Cassie Ventura, and saying that it was a complicated one and that they were truly in love with each other. But of course, attacking Cassie, and he even called her a gangster. He said, and that's what the defense does. They will poke holes in the evidence and say, Cassie was in agreement with these things. She's the one who called for those escorts. She's the one that paid them, which the evidence does show. But the other side of it, the prosecution is saying that she was forced to do these things. It's very typical for the defense, again, to turn that around, to try to make the victim look like the villain. That's what you've seen. And we even saw a snapshot of that already with Tom Cassie. If you recall in one of my videos, I talked about this, where the body cam footage of when Tom was arrested and he was booked and he was in the police station, and he was saying, hey, I want to talk to you guys, but I want my attorney here, but I want to tell you about my sister's husband who abuses her, essentially deflecting, because as you all know, his sister, his youngest sister, is one of the victims, one of the 4 victims against Tom Cassie. So he's using that as a deflection, as if it negates somehow any of the abuse against his sister or the other victims who have nothing to do with his family. So it's something typical that you see, and it's unfortunate, and only time will tell. Did any of these arguments that the defense had in their closing arguments in the Sean Combs case, whether it had any teeth to it for the jury to consider. Again, they just argued, they're both willing participants, meaning Cassie and Jane Doe, talking about the arson and Kid Cudi's car that was blown up, and arguing that there was no evidence, direct evidence that Sean Combs had anything to do with it. That might be, but there was, I believe, circumstantial evidence. So at one point in the defense's closing argument, Mark Agnifilo became quite sarcastic, to the point that the lead prosecutor, Maureen Comey, stood up and she objected to the judge, saying that she objected because he was being so sarcastic. And he actually said, he responded and said, respectfully, I think I am allowed to be sarcastic. Well, the judge apparently did not agree, and he admonished him, and he said, Mr. Agnifilo, for you, please don't do that again. It is grossly improper. I personally would not ever want a judge to say that to me in front of a jury. So I think that circumstance, even by itself, even if we didn't hear the one about the argument where Sean's chasing Cassie and defending the fact that he beat her up because of a phone, I think that both of those things together, I just don't think that scored any points with the jury. And I think that really probably did not go well with the jury at all. So about the drugs, then they argue that Cassie was a drug addict, that she was a willing participant in that. No distribution of the drugs, just that they were all in agreement in taking the drugs, and that this is their lifestyle. They're swingers, and they're all willing participants of these freak-offs. And, that's going to be up to the jury to decide. So some of the problems that I saw with the prosecution, so I said this early on when they first started the trial, because as you guys know, if you've been watching my channel, there's this parallel going on. There's all this exposure going on in the church with all of the SA and the spiritual abuse. And then in the secular, in celebrities, it's going on as well. And all of it is getting exposed together. All of it is. It's like coming at us like a fire hydrant that's uncontrolled. Can't stop that fire, that water coming out of that fire hydrant. And that's really how I see this happening. But so when I said this about early on, just based upon my experience in regard to the prosecution, when I learned that it was 6 white females, right? And that they were younger, meaning like in their 30s, less than 40, I was concerned, because I would like to have seen at least one male, if not 2, on the prosecution team. I would like to have seen some diversity, because we know that the jury panel is diverse, especially in larger cities. There's diversity, there's ethnic diversity. I would have liked to have seen some ethnic diversity on that prosecution team. Whether it matters, I don't know. I don't even know if anybody's even brought that up. It's just something I noticed right away. I can just tell you from my experience, especially being in Detroit, there's all types of ethnicities, and sometimes they just don't resonate with certain people, and it's just, I'm not being biased or anything. It's just it's a reality, and I think at the very bare minimum, a male prosecutor added to the team could have been helpful. There's males on the jury, and so I don't know if that would ever even be an issue. We won't know unless somebody asks that of the jury, or if they say that, they voluntarily say that. They may not ever admit it, even if it is. So it's just something that I saw in the beginning. Whether the prosecution was effective they really, when you have that racketeering charge, it encompasses so much. It is very broad. So to me, the key would be trying to, lack of a better term, dumbing it down. You just really have to streamline it and weave that in and out of your case so that the jury is hearing it over and over, because after the closing arguments, the jury is going to hear the judge tell them the instructions. And you know what? As a prosecutor, I love that part because they had already heard it from me when I'm giving my summation. They're hearing elements of those crimes. And now they're going to hear it again from the trusted source, the judge. So, remember I said the dynamics, juries might not like the prosecutor or the defense. Usually it's just one of each. But in this case, there's multiple on each side. I promise you they didn't like somebody on the prosecution team, and I promise you similarly on the defense. It's just that way. We like who we like, we don't like who we don't like. But I'll tell you what, even no matter what in all of my years of doing jury trials, they typically will respect the judge, no matter what. The judge just sits in authority, and they are going to respect the judge. So the judge is going to be delivering those elements of the crimes, the jury instructions, and they're going to take note of that. Who talked about those elements more? Was it the defense or was it the prosecution? The prosecution has to, because they have to prove all the elements beyond a reasonable doubt. So, problem with the prosecution, if they were not effective in doing that, then you could have a lost jury who they just don't know. Maybe they're, confused about some things. Now, once they're deliberating, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but just once they're deliberating, we can kind of see where they're going by the questions if they have a question. So I'll talk about that last, when the jury deliberates. But I'm on a roll with the problems that I could see with the prosecution. So they had one witness who was impeached because she testified that Sean Combs was dangling her from a balcony on a date that it appears that he couldn't have even possibly been in New York. Is that a big deal? Can it be explained? Maybe, but from my understanding, it wasn't ever cleared up. Could they just dismiss the testimony of that witness? Yes, they could, because if they didn't find that witness credible because they got that date wrong, that's a possibility. But there were so many crimes that were addressed and testified to that I think that the government, they had a good amount that they were working with. And so in summation, trying to cull that in and just saying, hey, you only need to find 2 acts, 2 overt acts, 2 predicate acts here. I'm using these terms interchangeably. And that's all you need for RICO. And I think that that's good for the prosecution. That's a positive. I think that one of the issues for the prosecution could be the credibility of Cassie, potentially. For me, it wouldn't be. If I was a juror, I wouldn't consider this. Remember, Cassie got a $20 million settlement from Sean Combs before this case was even charged. She also testified on the stand that she was in the middle of negotiating a $10 million settlement against the hotel. But some people might think, well, that's why she's here. But those things happen outside of her testimony. Had nothing to do with, wasn't dependent on, it wasn't why she was there. And I'm not sure how well, if that is an issue, and I'm not sure how exactly the prosecution really did that. But they have 5 hours. I would suspect that they hit everything that could be a concern, an anticipated concern of the jury. Now, problems with the defense. All right, back to the fact. They don't have to put a defense on. They don't have to put in any evidence whatsoever, and Sean Combs does not have to take the stand. But again, sometimes the jury does want to see something, but again, they're instructed not to even consider that. They have to effectively poke holes in all the evidence and the theory of the prosecution's case. They have to effectively do that. There's 12 jurors. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each and every one of these crimes. Now, is it possible that the jury finds that they did meet their burden in some and not others? Absolutely. But the defense is in a better position because it's 12 people having to agree, right? 12 people. So it does seem like it's a very big deal. Sometimes it's when I remember when I was a prosecutor, sometimes thinking, you just go back after, especially after you're done. You're done with closing, you're babysitting your jury, meaning you have to be close to them, to the courthouse, to that courtroom, in case the jury has a verdict or if they have any questions. And you just start going through everything. Oh, I should have done this. Did this go in this way? And, it's life. You do the best you can, but there's always things that you could have done better. So another problem with the defense, again, just no witnesses at all to support Sean. None. Nobody coming in to give any account that could challenge or counter any of the witness testimony that was offered by the prosecution. And the defense attorney in his closing, as I've indicated, some of the remarks, some of the argument were described as abrasive and sarcastic. And I'm telling you, that might not go well with the jury. I just don't find that a jury does well with either side if they're arrogant, abrasive, sarcastic, demeaning. My understanding is on some of the witnesses that the defense cross-examined, they were demeaning. That might not go well. But again, I've had cases where, you talk to the jury afterward and they're like, well, I would expect the defense attorney to do that because, they're fighting for the defendant's life. So it could go either way. So now this case is in the hands of the jury. That's it. It's done. There's nothing you can do to change it. It's in the hands of the jury. And for the most part, I believe that juries take their job seriously. I do. And in this case, there's no reason to believe that they won't do that. Now, is there some element of stardom? Of course, because it's Sean Combs. So while they try to filter out in voir dire at the beginning of the case when they're picking the jury that somebody could potentially be on there just for the fact of being on a Sean Combs case, what goes along with that? Well, potentially fame and fortune for that juror, because they could be featured in a film, they could write a book, it could be lucrative. So you filter that out on the front end, right? But you don't really know. Could they have put the wool over the eyes of the defense and the prosecution's team and got on there? It's just a consideration. But for the most part, again, I say they take it seriously. They're going to look at the evidence. Could they get in there? And some juries, they say, oh, when we first got in there, we just took a poll on each and every charge. Some of them will look to other jury members that have been on juries before for some guidance. I've seen that. There will be a foreman, but for the most part, they're all working together, right? They're going through the evidence together. And then they have to go through each and every element of each crime and then move through that to see whether or not they all agree. And they work through it. And although they've all been together hanging out, they haven't been able to talk about the case until they get to the deliberation room. And I promise you, not only are they talking about the evidence, they're talking about the attorneys. They do. They will talk about the attorneys. Could it affect their ultimate decision? It could. But I think that, you've got the 12 jurors, they'll wrangle each other back in to just say, let's hone in on the evidence. The evidence shows this. Their decisions need to be based upon the evidence and not about emotions, not about who they did or didn't like. They might not like Sean Combs just because of the fact that they saw that video of him beating Cassie. But they really have to put that aside to determine whether or not the prosecution, the government, met their burden to prove each and every element of the crimes that have been charged. So what do you guys think? about what you've heard, what you've seen, even what I'm sharing here. I'd like to hear what your thoughts about it. Me personally, I believe the victims. I believe that these things happen to them, and I do believe them. I inherently believe victims. Are there times that there are people that allege to be victims that I don't believe? Yes, there are times. And I've shared that before on my channel, that as a prosecutor, there were times where I had signed a warrant, charged somebody, and then, you're in discovery and then you figure out, I don't think this person really was a victim. And then I dismiss it because as a prosecutor, you wear the white hat. You are the one that is in search of truth and justice. And you never want to go through prosecution just solely to prosecute somebody, especially if you know that there's some doubt as to whether or not this person committed these crimes. I mean, you have to have confidence in that as a prosecutor. And I believe that happened here. I believe that the government were very confident in their case. The elected, or not elected, this is the United States Attorney. Okay, so he's appointed. So I can't remember his name, but I remember him coming out last year in a press conference and very, very confident, talking about the evidence. And so I believe that it was correctly brought, correctly charged. Could there have been more victims involved? Yeah, just from what we know, because other people have come out and said that they're victims. But I just don't know what happened to that. Another thing that I have a question on, let me know if you do as well. There was evidence that Sean Combs had video of other people, maybe people in the industry, celebrities, in these freak-offs. Now, there was evidence saying that he would use that against them, maybe to control them. I don't know. But if there was any evidence that perhaps somebody else was committing a crime, if there was any video of this, why haven't we seen any other charges? Now, I'm just speculating here. But you know what? Think about this. For those of you that have watched the Daystar scandal, what did we all focus on? What was so compelling? The audio recordings. Remember? The audio recordings by Jonathan Lamb in those board meetings with his mother, with Tom Callender, with Jimmy Evans. That, if we didn't have those recordings, it's a he said, she said, and the recordings just brought it to another level. We know what happened. And you know what? Even with those recordings, there's still people that say, I mean, they're minimal, that don't believe Jonathan and Susie because they're so on board with Daystar. Similarly here, if we didn't have that video of Sean Combs beating Cassie Ventura, perhaps people wouldn't know the degree of violence that he carries. Now, again, he's not charged with DV. That would be a state crime. And if you're wondering why wasn't he charged with that, I can just imagine some of the comments that I'm going to have with questions. Well, he wasn't because the state of California, that prosecutor there in that jurisdiction, which I believe would have been in LA, they decided not to. You know, we've seen that before. We saw that in the OJ trial where there were pleas for help by Nicole Brown, domestic violence, which led to her murder. And they didn't do anything. And it's really sad. And so we have to do better. You know, we have to be aware of these things. That's why we do these videos, particularly about the state of the church right now in all over this country. It's coming out and coming out, and I don't believe it's going to stop anytime soon. God is uncovering and exposing the crimes, the abuse that's going on in church, and then paralleling it or mirroring it, we see things like this going on with celebrities. So I believe that if they are to start their deliberations on Monday, which would be June 30th. I believe that there should be a verdict by maybe Wednesday. I mean, I would hope by Wednesday, but at least by Thursday. As you all know, July 4th holiday is Friday. I would anticipate that these jurors, they've been in this for so many weeks, almost 2 months now, that they want to be done with it as well. So if he is convicted of RICO, he's looking at a life sentence. And I think, I'm not sure what the mandatory minimum on the RICO is, but it might be 15 to 20. If he's found guilty of the sex trafficking, the minimum mandatory, I think, is 10 or 15 years. So if he's found guilty on these charges, he's looking at going to federal prison. If he's found not guilty on all of them, he gets released immediately. But what will that look like for him in life? Going back to his life and his businesses. I don't know. But I think either way, whether there's a conviction or not, it's not the end of the story. There's going to be more things that come out, and we also have those civil cases that are against him. So stay tuned. I might be talking about this again, I'm not sure. But I'm glad that I had the opportunity to share my thoughts and commentary on this subject with you, as several of you have been asking. So I hope that satisfies some of your questions. And if not, if you have questions, certainly put them down there in the comments and we'll have a conversation. And I look forward to the next video.